For most of history, money has been the cleanest way to measure power. Armies, weapons, logistics, technology, all of them cost something. If you outspend your rival by a factor of 10, you're supposed to win. In the Vietnam War, the United States ran that experiment to the extreme. At its peak, America deployed more than 500,000 troops, dropped more tonnage of bombs than it had in all of World War II in the Pacific, and spent, by some estimates, the equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars in today's money. Vietnam, by contrast, was a small, poor country with limited industry, no nuclear weapons, and a per capita income a fraction of the American level. On paper, this was not a contest, and yet, after years of escalation, tens of thousands of American lives lost, and staggering material expenditure, the United States left without victory. So how does a superpower that can outspend its opponent on almost every metric lose a war it is not supposed to lose? The answer is not a simple slogan about guerrilla warfare or a single bad decision. It is a pattern, a mismatch between what money can buy, what politics demands, and what a particular type of war actually requires. To understand that pattern, we have to start in the moment when American power looks almost absolute. In the 1950s and early 1960s, the United States sits at the peak of its post-war strength. Its economy is the largest in the world. Its industry can mass-produce ships, planes, vehicles, and ammunition on a scale no rival can match. It commands a globe-spanning network of bases, alliances, and intelligence. The experience of World War II has left a deep imprint on American strategy. Mobilize the arsenal of democracy, apply overwhelming force, grind down the enemy's capacity to fight. For a while, it seems like this model is universally applicable, but the Cold War adds a new layer. The competition is no longer just about territory, it is about ideology, credibility, and perception. The domino theory and the idea that if one country falls to communism, neighbors will follow, turns local conflicts into perceived tests of global resolve. Vietnam, in this framing, is not simply a former French colony struggling over its post-colonial future. It becomes a symbol. If the United States cannot prevent a communist victory in South Vietnam, the fear is that allies elsewhere will start to doubt American guarantees. Commitment in one place is supposed to signal commitment everywhere. Inside this logic, backing down looks more dangerous than pressing on. And if you believe that credibility is on the line, it is easy to conclude that more resources will eventually solve the problem. You can always send more advisors, more troops, more planes, more aid. You can always spend more. The first escalations in Vietnam follow this familiar script. At each stage, American leaders tell themselves they are adding just enough force to stabilize the situation. A few thousand advisors become tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. Limited bombing campaigns become sustained air wars. Military aid turns into deep involvement in the internal politics of South Vietnam. On the spreadsheets in Washington, the numbers grow. The cost per month, the sorties flown, the tonnage of bombs dropped, the body counts reported. The problem is not that these numbers are fake. The problem is that they are lopsided. They measure what America is good at producing: firepower, logistics, spending, and they underweight the dimensions of conflict that decide whether that firepower is actually decisive. Vietnam is not a conventional symmetric contest between two industrial states with clear front lines. It is a complex civil war intertwined with decolonization, nationalism, and regional politics. The United States can destroy infrastructure, inflict casualties, and temporarily secure territory. But its model of victory assumes that if you attrit the enemy enough, a political solution you like will naturally follow. That assumption turns out to be wrong. One of the core mismatches lies in the metrics of success. In Vietnam, the US military often measures progress by body count, how many enemy fighters are killed. On a chart, this can look impressive, but body count assumes a fixed pool of opponents and a clear distinction between combatants and civilians. In a conflict where recruitment is fueled by occupation, bombing, and local grievances, these assumptions break. Killing more people does not necessarily reduce resistance. It can generate new recruits faster than it depletes the existing force. From a distance, the curve of enemy losses may slope upward. On the ground, control over villages, networks, and loyalties remains fluid. A similar mismatch appears in the use of air power. The United States drops enormous tonnage of bombs on North Vietnam and on supply routes. Factories, bridges, and infrastructure are damaged or destroyed. But Vietnam's war effort is not built on a fragile, just-in-time industrial system that collapses under such pressure. It is more decentralized, more willing to absorb casualties, and more able to adapt. Alternative supply routes emerge. Work is done at night, materials are moved on foot, by bicycle, through jungle paths that are harder to target from the air. The cost to the US taxpayer of each sortie, each plane, each precision-guided effort is enormous. The cost to the other side of dispersing and adapting is much lower. The asymmetry is not just moral, it is economic. At the same time, there is a deeper pattern in how the war is framed politically. American leaders repeatedly promise that victory is achievable, that the next escalation will turn the tide, and that backing down would be catastrophic for credibility, but they are not willing to mobilize the home front in the way they did in World War II. There is no complete shift to a war economy. Taxes are not raised to fully cover the cost. The broader public is told it can have both guns and butter. The result is a kind of partial war. Massive resources are deployed abroad, but the political system tries to keep the conflict peripheral and manageable at home. This mismatch creates strain. As casualties mount and televised images of the war reach living rooms across America, public support erodes. The draft becomes a focal point of anger. Protests intensify. Trust in institutions weakens. From the perspective of the Vietnamese side, this is not just a backdrop. It is part of the strategic equation. They understand that they do not need to defeat the United States militarily in the way Germany or Japan was defeated in 1945. They need to make the war prolonged, costly, and politically unsustainable. If staying is more expensive in blood, treasure, and domestic cohesion than leaving, then leaving becomes the rational choice for the superpower. In that sense, the war is partly a contest of endurance and partly a contest of political pain tolerance. There is also a structural problem with the way the United States relies on local partners. The US strategy assumes that a viable South Vietnamese state can be strengthened and supported to the point where it can stand on its own. Money is poured into training, equipment, and institution building. But state building is not a neutral process. When huge flows of aid arrive in a fragmented political environment, they can entrench corruption, factionalism, and dependence. Local elites compete not to build legitimacy from the population, but to secure access to external resources. The sheer scale of American spending heightens this dynamic. Money becomes both a tool and a distortion. On paper, budgets are large, units are trained, and programs are funded. On the ground, the link between those inputs and effective governance can be weak. When the external patron leaves, structures built to serve short-term patronage struggle to survive as long-term institutions. In this sense, the very financial weight of the US commitment creates a fragile architecture. It is like building tall on uncertain foundations. The moment support is withdrawn, the structure wobbles. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, several curves are converging. Financial costs are running far above early projections. Casualty numbers are higher than the public expected for a limited conflict. Trust in official statements has been eroded by years of optimistic assessments that did not match events. Internationally, the prestige of the United States is dented by images of destruction, civilian suffering, and a war that seems both morally contested and strategically inconclusive. Domestically, the war interacts with broader social conflict, civil rights, generational divides, and debates over the role of America in the world. In this environment, continuing to escalate becomes politically toxic, but fully admitting defeat also feels unacceptable. The result is a search for an exit that can be framed as peace with honor. Negotiations, Vietnamization, and phased withdrawals are all parts of this process. Yet when the final test comes, when local forces must stand without large-scale American support, the underlying weaknesses show. The North Vietnamese and their allies are willing to bear immense costs for a clear political objective. The structures in the South prove vulnerable once the external pillar is removed. The outcome is not a comforting compromise, it is the fall of Saigon. The superpower that outspent its opponent many times over leaves without achieving its stated goals. So, what is the pattern? One way to summarize it is this. The United States tried to solve a fundamentally political and social conflict with tools optimized for industrial, high-intensity war. It spent heavily on the dimensions it knew how to measure: weapons, sorties, aid dollars, troop levels, and underestimated the power of local legitimacy, the adaptability of an opponent fighting on home terrain, and the constraints imposed by its own domestic politics. Money amplified what the strategy got right, but it also amplified what the strategy got wrong. Every escalation raised the sunk costs, raised expectations, and raised the political stakes, without changing the basic misalignment between means and ends. The lesson is not that money never matters. It clearly does. The lesson is that beyond a certain point, throwing more resources at a misspecified problem does not fix it. It just makes the eventual reckoning more painful. If this sounds like a purely military story, it isn't. The Vietnam pattern has echoes far beyond Southeast Asia. Whenever a powerful system assumes that more spending, more data, or more technical capacity can substitute for a clear political theory of victory, it is walking down a similar path. Whenever decision-makers fixate on metrics that are easy to count but only loosely linked to what actually matters on the ground, they risk mistaking activity for progress. Whenever leaders believe that credibility requires continuing a failing course because we've already invested too much, they turn sunk costs into a trap. In Vietnam, that trap was measured in lives and dollars. In other domains, it can show up as decades of unprofitable interventions, massive infrastructure projects that do not solve the problems they were meant to solve, or financial systems that keep getting bailed out because the alternative is considered unthinkable. The pattern is consistent. Overwhelming resources create the illusion that trade-offs can be deferred. But trade-offs do not disappear. They accumulate. On this channel, we are not here to relitigate every tactical decision of the Vietnam War or to assign simple blame. We are here to trace collapse patterns, cases where huge advantages on paper turn out not to guarantee the outcomes everyone assumed. Spain drowning in silver, Britain winning 2 world wars and losing its empire, the Soviet Union controlling half of Europe and collapsing without losing a battle, the dollar system becoming too powerful to fail, and here a superpower spending a fortune in Vietnam and still losing the war. If you want to see how these stories rhyme and what they might say about the conflicts, commitments, and systems we live inside today, subscribe to Collapse Pattern. Don't just watch history happen, see it coming.